Hello, it's Craig here with a breakdown on talismans. Let's be real, the biggest question everyone wants answered is whether Soreseals are worth it or not, which I will definitely get to. In fact, I will answer it so well, the next time someone asks this question again, you can just link them this video as your argument, whether it is for or against. But part of the question depends on how strong the other talismans are, since you only have 4 talisman slots. So, we're going to break down the majority of the talismans step by step before we touch upon the Soreseals. This will be a 2-part guide, with the first part discussing the math behind talismans themselves. The second part will go deeper into comparing talismans in both the PvE and PvP setting. Why did I say the breakdown will be for the majority of the talismans? Well, it's because I'm going to ignore power creep charms like the Arsenal Charm +1, because Great Jar's Arsenal is simply a stronger version of it. I will also only briefly mention the following talismans that are a bit more exploration or resource based, rather than a practical choice for boss fighting or PvP dueling and the sort. Here we go, a 30-second speedrun. Silver Scarab helps with farming items, and Gold Scarab helps with farming runes. Moon of Noxtella is useless because you have enough memory slots even without it. The Wool talismans if you want to turn on hard mode. Something interesting is, you can equip Shabiri's Woe before summoning your Mimic Spirit Ash, and then unequip the talisman. Your Mimic will become your taunt tank. The next 4 are for sneak and disguises. Long-tailed Cat Talisman is a lie. And the best use of Sacrificial Twig is to equip it after you have already died once, not before. It will prevent you from losing the runes already dropped, and the runes on you. Okay, with that done, I'll start off with some less math-intensive talismans to get you settled in for the ride. We'll begin with the consumable buffing charms. The Perfumer's Talisman buffs the damage of perfume items by 20%. There appears to be no bonuses for perfumes that don't do damage. The Companion Jar buffs crackpots and ritual pots by 20%. I personally don't use consumables that often, and I don't think these are that strong. It is possible to make a pot-throwing build that deals quite a bit of damage though. I just prefer all the other playstyles where I don't have to keep farming consumables. The Arrow's Reach Talisman increases the range of your bow, which can be quite helpful in PvE sometimes when you're trying to snipe something. It also apparently works on some spells. The exact rule is unknown, but it works for spells like Rock Sling or Ambush Shard. This is probably an unintended effect due to shared coding for arrow shots and some spells. The Arrow Sting Talisman increases the power of both bows and crossbows by 10%. Since there is a limited number of ways to increase bow damage, the Arrow Sting Talisman is pretty much mandatory if your build is based entirely on a bow or crossbow. Next, let's cover some talismans that have to do with specific types of attacks. There seems to be a misunderstanding about the Godfrey icon. The Godfrey icon increases the damage of fully charged spells and weapon arts by 15%. The keyword here is fully. It doesn't do anything for slightly charged attacks. For example, if you hold the Comet spell for a bit, you don't get 15% damage bonus from the Godfrey icon, just because the Comet is chargeable. It also doesn't work on charged bow shots. The Axe Talisman boosts charge heavy attacks by 10%. This is useful in PvE if the charge heavy attack is an integral part of your build. But 10% isn't a whole lot, and you're sort of locking yourself into using charge attacks, which are slow, in order to get value out of this talisman. In PvP, charge heavy attacks are typically quite bad. Of course, there are exceptions like the Urumi, but this talisman definitely wouldn't be your first choice overall. As for the Curved Sword Talisman, it works better for PvE than PvP, because guard counters are super obvious in PvP. For PvE, if blocking and countering attack is integral to your build, this is a great talisman. Claw Talisman boosts jump attacks by 15%, which is quite a lot considering jump attacks are easy to do and quite strong, especially with their higher stagger. It is also particularly good with power stancing, since for many weapon types, you would be swinging both weapons at the same time. The Hammer Talisman is a very conditional talisman that makes you more effective against shields, but there are a lot of other ways to deal with shields like status effects, guard ignores, or attacking while the shield isn't up. Because I don't expect people to keep swapping talismans whenever they see an enemy with a shield, I don't really recommend this one. The Lance Talisman buffs horseback damage, so you can swap to this in the overworld if you enjoy mounted combat. But you can't fight most bosses on horseback, So once again, if you don't like swapping talismans on the fly, not really recommended. Twin Blade Talisman increases the final attack of your attack chain by 20%. This basically only works on light attacks. The Spear Talisman is a great talisman for thrusting weapons, especially in PvP. I explained counterattacks in detail in my Spear guide. The Spear Talisman buffs the effect by another 15%, which is multiplicative. Including the base 30% reduction on negation, you're actually reducing the enemy's versus Pierce negation by 49.5%. The Great Shield Talisman boosts your guard stability, which is how much stamina damage you're taking while guarding. It used to boost stability by 10% before the 1.04 patch, but it no longer has a strict formula now. It seems to differ from shield to shield and weapon to weapon. Yes, this works with guarding with two-handed weapons too. It works very well with the Curved Sword Talisman for a guard-based build in PvE. It is also still very powerful in PvP with great shields. Next, let's talk about some spell-related talismans. The Faithful's Canvas Talisman and the Graven Skull Talisman are the weaker versions of the Flock's Canvas Talisman and Graven Mask Talisman. I'm still covering them because it is possible to equip both the 4% and the 8% boost at the same time. Although I only really recommend the 8% versions. Once again, this is due to opportunity cost. You can almost always find something better to fill that slot with than a 4% bonus, even if you're a pure caster build. Radagon Icon increases your VDEX by 30, which is to say it increases your cast speed equivalent to having 30 extra dexterity. This is a good pick for spell builds, but it is not a requirement. Because of how animation works, it increases your overall cast speed by varying amounts depending on the spell itself. Cast speed bonus from dexterity also caps at a maximum of 70, so there is no point using this talisman if you already have 70 or more dexterity. Old Lord's Talisman increases the duration of buff type spells by 30%. This does not apply to Ashes of War, so a Golden Vow casted with the Ash of War will not have their duration increased. The effect will be removed if you swap this talisman off after casting your buff spell. This is mainly useful for incantation builds with plenty of buffs, as it saves you FP from having to cast the buff less, and also, more importantly, saves time in battle while preventing you from being vulnerable. It's actually quite a decent talisman I don't find many people running. Oh, one more thing. It also increases the duration of heal over time spells like Bestial Vitality and Blessing of the Earth Tree. The Primal Glintstone Blade is IMO, a bad talisman. The HP loss is not worth the FP saved. It also fails as a supporting tool for Lusats. If you want a full breakdown with the math behind it, check out my dual wield staff guide. Next, let's talk about some miscellaneous talismans. The Crucible Knot Talisman is a talisman FPS players are salivating over right about now. But Elden Ring isn't an FPS game. You can probably guess just exactly how popular this talisman is. The Crucible Feather Talisman increases your dodge by 6 frames in 60 FPS. If you want the frame data of all the dodges and parries, I have them on my Discord. Link is in the description down below. However, it also increases your damage taken by 30%. I don't really use this talisman because I find learning the timing on dodges is better than praying 6 frames will save you from a poorly timed dodge. It also becomes very punishing when you do not dodge as you take 30% more damage. The Bullgoat's Talisman is a simple sounding talisman that isn't very simple. If any of you watched a video on how Bullgoats isn't actually doing what it said it's doing, you're probably very confused. So I'll try to explain it in simpler terms what this talisman does. First up, the Bullgoat doesn't actually increase your poise by 33.3%. It reduces incoming poise damage by 25%. This is essentially the same thing, if not for hyper armor. Let's take a look at an example. An attack is going to hit you with 100 poise damage. You have 90 poise. If Bullgoat performs like it reads, you will have 33.3% more poise, which is 120 poise. 100 poise damage would be 83.3% of your poise health. But the Bullgoat actually reduces incoming poise damage by 25%. So 100 poise damage turns into 75 poise damage. 75 divided by 90 is still 83.3% poise health, even if your status sheet reads version 1 of Bullgoat's Talisman, which is that you have increased poise health. Which, in a sense, you do. The confusing part only comes because of hyper armor, which you can think of as temporary poise. This is fixed depending on the move you're doing, and it does not get increased by Bullgoats if Bullgoat actually increases your poise by 33.3%. The problem is, Bullgoat is reducing incoming poise damage instead of increasing your poise. What happens in scenario 2 is, if let's say you have 50 additional poise from hyper armor, with Bullgoat equipped, you're taking 25% less poise damage. Therefore, instead of needing 50 poise to cover the amount of hyper armor you got, your opponents would need 66.6 poise damage instead to do the same amount of poise they would be doing when you don't have Bullgoat's Talisman on. You're basically getting free poise if your move has hyper armor because Bullgoat doesn't calculate the way it reads. Alright, let's go back to some simpler talismans. These are the critical hit related talismans, which proc either on a riposte, stance break, or a backstab. The Assassin's Crimson and Cerulean Dagger really helps a ton with sustain, especially on sneaky builds or poise break builds. There is a percent component and a flat component for the Assassin's Crimson Dagger. It restores 10% plus 85 flat HP. At 60 Vigor, you would have 1900 HP. This talisman will restore 275 HP, which is basically 14.5% of your max HP. The Dagger Talisman increases your critical hit damage by 17%. On bosses, you must remember a large portion of your damage is diverted to stance breaking, which is not critical damage. Therefore, your overall damage increase is probably closer to 9% when fighting bosses. As for the Crucible Scale Talisman, you really want to just avoid getting critical hit at all. While this can greatly reduce incoming critical hit damage, it won't be something you actually slot because of how rarely enemies should land critical hits on you. The status effect talismans probably needs no introduction. They give a ton of damage for 20 seconds after either you or a nearby enemy is affected by either the poison or the bleed status effect. The bonus also carries over to spell damage. They're very strong and easy to maintain with a status build, which is already strong in and of itself. These are the resistance talismans, which can help you out with whatever the zone's primary status application is. They can also help you take an extra hit in PvP, especially the robustness one for preventing bleed or frostbite, the two most popular status effects in PvP. There is also a talisman that gives 60 of each immunity, robustness, and focus. This is nice if you just want an overall boost to status effect resistance for PvP. But for PvE, you'll mostly be sticking to one status effect talisman since you don't usually meet multiple status effects of a different resistance from the same zone. The equip load talismans are very powerful, especially for PvP, when the good PvE options are typically nerfed. Let's take a look at just exactly how many stat points they're giving. First up, these talismans would essentially be like investing points into endurance, the attribute that governs stamina, robustness, and equip load. Equip load is usually the reason you're investing into endurance, to meet the under 70% weight limit requirement for medium rolls. First, both of these talismans are quite heavy, at 1.5 weight. You can think of this as the cost. The thing is, these talismans are percent based, so the more equip load you originally have, the more points of endurance they tend to account for. This is because endurance itself is quite a steady increase. You can even get more value out of it if you manage to avoid the dip in investment value. Let's take a good look at equip loads. I suggested in my compendium that all builds 125 and above should have at the very least 15 endurance so you can wear decent armor. So we'll take a look at 15, 20, 25, and 30 endurance. This is the equip load at each endurance level. Erdtree gives 8% equip load, while the Great Jars gives 19% equip load. They do indeed stack multiplicatively, but let us look at them individually. These are the values for 8% and 19% of the equip load respectively. Now, let us convert them to the number of endurance points these numbers translate to. If you want to take into account their heavy weight, you can subtract 1 point of endurance from these columns. As you can see here, even at the 15-point endurance mark, the Great Jar is worth 6.73 points of endurance, or 5.73 points if we take into account its base weight. And at higher levels of endurance, like at 25 endurance, if you still need all the weight Great Jar gives you, you can gain roughly 11 points of endurance. This is quite a bit of stats, especially if you're comparing it to something like the Soreseals, that gives you 20 points for a 15% reduction on all your negation stats. While the Erdtrees doesn't give as much equip load, it also grants 9.6% stamina. which is worth about 6 points of endurance even at the 15-point endurance level, since you get very little stamina for each point of investment. Furthermore, it gives 4% max HP. It's hard to pinpoint how many points of vigor HP percentage is worth because it varies greatly depending on where you are on the curve. The important thing to realize is at 60 vigor, it is very difficult to increase your HP anymore after that because there is a steep drop off. Therefore, percent HP bonuses tend to be really good after reaching somewhere near 55 or more vigor. Yeah, you don't get the fire defense or immunity, but the bonus from that is very minimal per point of vigor. HP is definitely the biggest factor here. It isn't difficult to make an argument for Earth trees at PvP meta levels or above. Talking about HP, let's discuss some HP talismans. Crimson Amber Medallion is very light even for a talisman, and it also gives 8% max HP. I just gave an example of how good HP percent is for the Earth trees. This basically gives you double the HP percent, so it is very good for PvP, especially for duels. For PvE though, you might try considering the Crimson Seed Talisman, which I also rarely see get used in builds. There's no shame in drinking flasks. Elden Ring can be a hard game, and 20% boost for plus 12 Crimson Tears is equivalent to 162 HP. At 60 vigor, that's a whole 8.5% HP regained if you don't overheal. Even if you do, you usually carry more than one Crimson Flask with you, so it is very easy to get the value at least one time. But healing flasks are not used in duels as a general etiquette. Everywhere else though, this is a good talisman to have if you have a heavy Crimson Flask focus setup. The Blessed Dew Talisman is something I don't usually equip. At 2 HP per second, it takes a whole minute to regenerate 120 HP. This isn't bad, but it is quite slow. It doesn't help much with sudden danger when you're forced into a tight spot. The biggest use is probably equipping this talisman when you decide you need a bathroom break, or just don't want to reset the area if you're struggling with exploration. Continuing with the HP talismans, we have the two talismans that give decent bonus at 100% HP. You can even use them together to make staying at 100% HP easier. Both of these are mostly for PvE instances, because in PvP, a fan dagger or just a consumable in general very easily gets your opponents off 100% HP if you really need to. On the other end of the spectrum, we have the feathered branches, which give you an even larger boost when you're at below 20% HP. On their own, they're a bit lackluster, unless, of course, you want to do a no-hit boss fight. Then, the Red Feather Talisman is probably your best friend. For general PvE, you typically want to keep your current HP high enough so you don't accidentally get one-shotted. For PvP, these can turn things around, but it's not difficult to directly die without ever reaching under 20%. If you are under 20%, it's usually a one-shot. However, if you combine the two talismans together, you can greatly extend the power and duration of your under 20% rage mode by being harder to kill by some small pokes, while hitting 20% harder for a chance at a glorious comeback. I suggest running them together or not running them at all. Since we discussed HP, we might as well cover FP now. Cerulean Amber Medallion is decently useful early game, especially when it's more worth it to invest into Vigor before 40 Vigor. Because your fast level is easily upgradable, and usually your fast regeneration exceeds your max FP, you can gain a significant amount of FP by gaining more max FP, since each FP flask would essentially help you gain more FP as well. On the other hand, the Cerulean Sea Talisman is crap because you don't need that much FP. By the time your max FP is naturally higher than your flask FP regeneration, you're not hungry for FP anymore. So this talisman doesn't really serve a purpose, as FP flasks typically fully regenerate your FP. The Ancestral Spirit Horn is useful in builds that are FP efficient, as it greatly increases your sustain if you don't burn too much FP per kill. The Carrion Filigree Crest is very powerful, especially earlier on in the game when you don't have enough FP and focus on your weapon art. Late game, you tend to have enough FP to not worry about it as much. But it can still be useful if your build is stat hungry and relies on the weapon art. More on weapon art, the Shard of Alexander is superb. Ashes of War tends to be decently FP efficient and effective. If your build relies heavily on weapon art, this is pretty much a guarantee slot. On the other hand, Roar Medallion seems to be underpowered for what it does. It doesn't increase the dragon roars, and only increases the damage of specific weapon arts, like the Beast's Roar or Braggart's Roar. I would expect this to be 20% or something, because you can pretty much just slot the Shard of Alexander for the majority of the time and not get restricted to roar skills. Of course, you can stack them together if you're running roar skills, but I would have preferred them to be unstackable, with a roar medallion buff to 20%. As for the last resource, stamina, you regenerate 45 stamina per second, with few ways to increase this. Endurance does not increase your stamina regeneration, but max stamina, which in my opinion is far less helpful after a certain point. The thing is, even if you have 1 stamina, you can perform a move, even if it costs more than 1 stamina. Therefore, in continuous battles, stamina regeneration often matters more than max stamina. Imagine a scenario where you ran out of stamina, and now you're regenerating. You regenerated 20 stamina in the time before your next stamina consumption. Your next move costs 21 stamina. Now, you have 0 stamina. If you had the Turtle Talisman, you would have 23 stamina instead. The move that costs 21 stamina would leave you with 2 stamina, which allows you to chain into another move directly, regardless of its stamina cost. And here I want to take an extra look at Erdtree once again, this time to compare Erdtree not using stats, but to other talismans, because you can essentially think of it as a bit of each of the 3 talismans. It's 50% of Crimson Amber, 64% of Viridian Amber, and 42% of Great Jars. Next, we have an interesting charm, the Blue Dancer charm. This charm only applies to physical damage you deal, and has quite a strict restriction. Honestly, I wouldn't use this charm if you go past 15 weight, and it weighs 0.9 on its own. It really is more for people doing no hit, otherwise this isn't great. Following the Blue Dancer, we have the multi-hit items, which activates after 3 hits, meaning the effect starts to take place on the 4th hit. These are the damage increase numbers for each tier. I included the Winged Sword insignia here to show you the numbers, but it is actually outclassed by the Rotten version, which is just stronger. You also can't equip both of them at the same time, so you'll always be running the Rotten when you can. However, you can run the Rotten Winged Sword with Millicent's prosthesis for a huge boost if you rely on successive attacks. Instead of increasing damage, we have the Godskin Swaddling Cloth that heals you in successive hits, which triggers after 3 to 7 attacks depending on what melee attacks you're doing. Taker's Cameo restores the same amount of HP as the Swaddling Cloth, except it does so on kills. I've listed the regeneration at 40, 50, and 60 vigor for your reference. They're both decent at sustaining HP. As for the Drake Talisman series, they increase the specific negation by 20% with their +2 version. These talismans have a significantly reduced effectiveness in PvP. They're better used in PvE when you are certain of the elemental damage type of the creatures in a region. If you want an overall negation to non-physical damage though, there is the Pearl Drake Talisman. This one, on the other hand, is better for PvP, especially in invasions where your opponents can use multiple elemental types. And finally, we're here, the Soreseals. I think I rewrote this example at least 10 times, trying to make it as easy on the math as possible. These talismans reduce all your negation by 15%, and yes, your negation can become negative, which would amplify the damage you take instead of reducing it. First of all, to discuss Soreseals, we need to understand what they give us. Essentially, Soreseals give us 20 points of stats. I say 20 points because I'm going to assume you're going to use all 20 points and cleverly redistribute your stats in order to make the Soreseal work for your build. Something that should be obvious is these Soreseals work much better at lower levels and much worse at higher levels. This is because 5 stat points at level 20 when you have a total of 99 stat points is worth roughly 5% of your total stat points, while 5 stat points at level 125 or 150 is worth only a bit over 2% of your total stat points. And so, we want to know just exactly when Soreseals aren't really that great anymore. Or more importantly for some people, whether they are still viable for PvP at these meta levels. And to answer that, I will cover the +5 stat point talisman alongside the Soreseals. Most people want to use Soreseals because they are lacking in some stats here or there, most likely because of requirements. So, we use the +5 stat point talisman to give you more stat points. They are the easiest to compare to. As an extra note, the Intelligence and Faith Talisman are actually 0.2 weight lighter, so you're better off using them when you can over the Strength and Dexterity Talisman if weight matters. But let's just treat this as a bonus. Since the Soreseals weigh 0.8 and also take up a Talisman slot, they are very comparable. First, let's see if the Heirloom Talismans are even worth using. We can just treat the 5 point as Vigor since we would be shifting the stat points around. Comparing 55 Vigor to 50 Vigor, you are 6.46% tankier for the 5 stat points you invested. Comparing 60 Vigor to 55 Vigor, you are 4.74% tankier only. For duels at least, this is weaker than the Crimson Amber Medallion that weighs lighter and increases your HP by 8%. And I'm using the 50 to 60 Vigor range because for PvP, an optimized build at level 125 or over will always have over 50 Vigor. I'm also using Vigor because it is the easiest stat to show percent increase, since Strength, Dexterity, Intelligence, and Faith all depend on what you're using. But in general, these stats will give less percent increase than Vigor. What we're going to do now is to subtract the Heirloom Talisman from the Soreseals, which would mean the Soreseals are actually giving you 15 more stat points for 15% reduced damage negation. And how should we quantify the 15 extra stat points? We will just treat them as Vigor as well, even though this is not true, because assuming you have 45 Vigor and the Soreseal helps push you from 45 to 60 Vigor is not a good assumption. This is because you would have already dropped some other stat points for more Vigor to increase your Vigor past 50 in order to optimize your build. However, for the sake of the argument, let's just pretend it works this way. If the Soreseals can't even pass this test that is skewed to favor it, then it just sucks. Now you're going to ask me how we should treat the negation, right? We will be looking at effective HP, otherwise known as EHP, instead of raw HP. This means that we convert HP into its effective form by taking into account damage negation. Dividing your current HP on the stat screen by 1 minus average negation will give you your EHP. For example, if you have 2000 HP and 20% negation, 2000 divided by 1 minus 0.2 equals 2500 EHP. Now, let's just use a decently realistic assumption of roughly 27% negation, which corresponds decently well to somewhere between 61 and 70 points, probably where a lot of builds are at. You can increase or decrease this negation, but the argument for Soreseals won't really change. I just want to give you a relatable example. If prior to Soreseals you have 45 Vigor, assuming you're running a Heirloom Talisman, after the Soreseal you would have 60 Vigor. For this, your negation is reduced by 15%, reaching only 12% average negation. Now, let's find the EHP for both cases. With 45 Vigor, you would have 2166 EHP, while with the Soreseals you would have 2159 EHP. No Soreseal wins by a tiny bit in this example, but reality is that it wins by even more. Why is this? Well, I already gave you the answer. What would actually happen with the 15 extra stat points is that you are more likely to distribute them evenly, like 5 points of Vigor and 10 points of Intelligence, rather than 15 raw points of Vigor, which favors Soreseals in the calculation, because we tap into the values where Vigor gives an even larger percent gain. Therefore, you would actually get even less effectiveness than the EHP example would suggest. This also doesn't take into account HP recovery, because if you do recover HP from sources like your flask, Soreseal would be an even larger detriment because you have less negation. While the HP recovery from the flask remains the same, you would have even less EHP because of the reduced negation. By the way, if you think investing into other stats like strength is better for the argument, it isn't. Let's use intelligence as an example. The offensive stat that benefits most from investing past 60, assuming you're a caster because of the existence of backloaded staffs. Let's use the highest non-Lusats to not have to deal with the extra FP cost discussion. You see that 15 points of intelligence is giving you 18.6% higher sorcery scaling. The Vigor in our example is making you 20.2% tankier. So my suggestion for meta PvP levels, stop getting confused by stat points and soft caps. If you don't understand soft caps, I have a video on that too. Seriously, if you really need to, just use the Heirloom Talismans. It is build dependent, but as a rough rule, I would try to avoid Soreseals past level 100, especially if it isn't for duels. How about the Scorpion Charms? These reduce your physical absorption by a significant amount too, but they increase the damage dealt by one magical damage type. Well, for the PvP side of things, this should be obvious since they are nerfed in PvP. Don't use them. For PvE though, these are great choices to maximize damage because they can buff a variety of spells and also applies to your weapon itself if you choose a different infusion, or the weapon art that can also deal the same type of damage as your spells. You can also easily offset their detriment with the last talisman on the list, Dragoncrest Great Shield Talisman, which greatly increases your physical negation. For some odd reason, even though the Pearl Drake only increases your non-physical negation by 9%, this talisman increases your physical negation by 20%. It is also nerfed for PvP, so it's more of a PvE talisman, but still, this is a ridiculous amount of negation. Those who only chase after shiny max numbers may never know how easy the entire game is with this talisman on. Sneak attacks? Whatever. Boss one-shots? What's that? Sometimes a good defense is your best offense too. Now that you know the math behind these talismans, Part 2 will be coming soon in a tier list format to help you better compare talismans in order to maximize the power you're getting from your 4 talisman slots. Like and subscribe so you don't miss it. Krite, signing out.